Hello, hello. Yeah. Hi guys. I hope the sound is coming. We are starting our second live stream of discussing decoloniality and observing how it uh, kind of is similar to the idea of Hindutva from the Bharatiya perspective. Uh, I'll be posting the link on Instagram now. Hope someone replies soon as to whether the audio is coming correctly or not. We will continue with the discussion of the book The Darker Side of Modernity by Walter de Mignolo, who is one of the world's foremost decolonial scholars. No one's here yet, I guess. Let's post the link. Hello. Yeah. Just posting the link on Instagram so that some people join, because I don't announce beforehand. That's a problem. Just posting the link on it. Yeah, it seems fine. Today also we'll do it for 1 hour up till 10:30 p.m. Cool. Let's start. Namaskar from Mumbai. Namaskar. Solanum isopersicum. I don't know if it's meant to be funny. Okay. So first of all, who am I? Am I an expert in sociology or decoloniality? Absolutely not. I'm just some guy who read Sai Deepak's first book, India That Is Bharat, and found it really interesting and intriguing. And now I'm in love with the idea of decoloniality, and I try to learn and read upon decoloniality as much as possible. Therefore, I'm just a learner, learning more on decoloniality and what are the specific academic perspectives of the people who came up with this idea, the exact scholars who came up with this idea. Because even Sai Deepak keeps saying that he's not the subject matter expert in this. He's taking a learner's approach when he's discussing decoloniality and putting it in the Bharatiya perspective and talking about it from the Bharatiya perspective, which no one else has done up until him. At least no one who lives in India. Only Mr. S. N. Balagangadhara has done it, and he has called it colonial consciousness as opposed to coloniality, but he lives in Belgium. So I'm learning more about decoloniality as I go on with it. I'm also sharing my experience. So it's like a live stream of a group study session. That's all it is. And I'm just a guy with a good Wi-Fi who wants to learn more about decoloniality. That's what it is. Okay, let's start. Pick up from exactly where we left yesterday. We are discussing Walter D. Mignolo's book, The Darker Side of Modernity. And Walter D. Mignolo was the person who gave a great review of Sai Deepak's book, but it got redacted later in later publications, I think, because I can't find it anywhere on the book. Because he probably came under pressure from Western liberals and Western Indians, Hindus who don't like the idea of Hindus standing up for themselves academically. They just want us to remain the people who get pissed off and charged with lathis, because they prevent all other avenues for us to speak up, and then they expect us to not get pissed off. Anyway, this is where we left off. This beautiful sentence differentiating between the ideas of nationalism in the West, in colonized societies or settler colonial societies, versus our society, which is the society which has survived colonialism, the difference between them. While the non-European world, while in the non-European world, post-nationalism, in the West, post-nationalism means end of nationalism, but in the West, post-nationalism means the beginning of a new era in which the concept of nationalism itself, it serves to reclaim identities. Now you'll see the thumbnail in my today's live stream. The figure on the right, that's a great painting. It's done by Abanindranath Thakur, the nephew of Rabindranath Thakur, and the painting is of Bharat Mata. I thought this was very relevant to this section, that's why I posted it here. Okay, let's just check if anyone else is joining. Views 1, yeah. Okay, let's just get on with it. While in the non-European world, it means the beginning of a new era in which the concept of nationalism serves to reclaim identities as the basis of state sovereignty. So there's no point calling our nationalism saying that, criticizing it, saying that India didn't exist before 1947, or nationalism is equal to jingoism or fascism, etc. The imperial partition of Africa among Western countries between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which provoked the First World War, did not replace the past of Africa with the past of Western Europe. And thus in South America, 500 years of colonial rules by peninsular officers, and since the early 1900s by Creole and Mestizo elites, did not erase the energy, force, the memories of the Indian past, compared with current issues in Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, southern Mexico, and Guatemala. Nor have the histories and memories of communities of African descent in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and the insular Caribbean been erased, the African communities in these places. With regard to the second orientation, I am witnessing many non-official rather than non-governmental transnational organizations not only manifesting themselves against capitalism and globalization and questioning modernity, but also opening up global but non-capitalist horizons and delinking from the idea that there is a single and primary modernity surrounded by peripheral or alternative ones. While not necessarily rejecting the modernity, not necessarily rejecting modernity, these organizations are making clear that modernity goes hand in hand with coloniality, as we discussed yesterday in yesterday's video. You should check out that as well. Modernity is surrounded by, while not necessarily rejecting, but making it clear that modernity goes hand in hand with coloniality, and therefore that modernity has to be assumed in both its glories and its crimes. Let's refer to this global domain as decolonial cosmopolitanism, and this is what Kushal Mehra doesn't understand. He thinks rejecting modernity means bringing back casteism. But whereas decolonial scholars and decoloniality is saying that both the good and bad of modernity, we are going to acknowledge them and then take a decolonial approach, not reject something just because it's new or Western. What happened in between the two scenarios outlined above between the 16th century and the 21st. The historian Karen Armstrong, looking at the history of the West from the perspective of a historian of Islam, has made two crucial points. Armstrong underscores the singularity of Western achievements in relation to, to known history, Western achievements in relation to known history until the 16th century, noting two salient spheres, economy and epistemology. In the sphere of economy, Armstrong points out, quote, the new society of Europe and its American colonies had a different economic basis, which consisted in reinvesting the surplus in order to increase production, as we understand economics and capitalism today. The first transformation, according to Armstrong, was thus the radical shift in the domain of economy that allowed the West to quote unquote reproduce its resources indefinitely, and is generally associated with colonialism. The second transformation, epistemological, is generally associated with the European Renaissance. Epistemological here shall be extended to encompass both science and knowledge and arts slash meaning. Science as science or knowledge and arts or meaning. Armstrong locates the transformation in the domain of knowledge in the 16th century, when Europeans quote unquote achieved a scientific revolution that gave them greater control over the environment than anybody had achieved before. No doubt Armstrong is right in highlighting the relevance of a new type of economy, that is capitalism, and the scientific revolution. They both fit and correspond to the celebratory rhetoric of modernity, that is, the rhetoric of salvation, that we saved you, and newness, based on European achievements during the Renaissance. उसके पहले कुछ था ही नहीं. There is, however, a hidden dimension of events that were taking place at the same time, both in the sphere of economy and in the sphere of knowledge. The dispensability or expendability, meaning it's okay if we lose it. Anything that you are okay with losing is called expendable or dispensability. So the expendability of human life and of life in general from the Industrial Revolution into the 21st century. That was what was the new thing that was happening, and it was the hidden dimension. The Afro-Trinidadian politician and intellectual Eric Williams succinctly described this situation by noting that, quote, one of the most important consequences of the glorious revolution of 1688 was the impetus it gave to the principle of free trade. Only in one particular did the freedom accorded in the slave trade differ from the freedom accorded in other trades. The commodity involved was man. Thus, hidden behind the rhetoric of modernity, economic practices dispensed with human lives and knowledge justified. Hidden behind the rhetoric of modernity, economic practices dispensed with human lives and knowledge justified racism and the inferiority of human lives that were naturally considered dispensable. In this context, you have to obviously bring up what happened in 1492 when Christopher Columbus landed in America and decided within a few hours after a rough survey that these people are less than human because they don't have a god or religion as we know it as Christopher Columbus. What we understand to be god or religion, they don't have that kind of a religion, and therefore that person does not have a spirit, and therefore that person is inferior, because if you don't even have a spirit and communicate with God the way we understand it, how are you a human being? And that's when the oppression of these people began. What they have, and that's the reason they have looked down upon pagan cultures and non-Abrahamic cultures all over the world from then on, because this person that I'm looking at does not communicate with God in the way I do, and therefore that's screwed up. In between the two scenarios described above, the idea of modernity came into picture. As opposed to modernity, the word modernity came into picture, but modernity as something better just because it's new, without any discussion of whether the thing in the past was better or not. That concept started to come into the picture. Let's read this paragraph once more. Thus, hidden behind the rhetoric of modernity, economic practices dispensed with human lives and knowledge justified racism and the inferiority of human lives that were naturally considered indispensable. Okay, since we are ending a chapter here, let's see if anyone else has joined. Yes, Lamant Indian de Karl Marx, এটা আগের দিনেরটার continuity. Okay, let's carry on with our discussion. In between the two scenarios described above, the idea of modernity came into picture. It appeared first as a double colonization of time and of space. Why, we'll get to that later, and if you have read the book by Sai Deepak, India that is Bharat, you will know a bit of it already. They monopolized time and space. In what way? The way we view time as multidimensional and cyclical, those things were gone. Time became a linear, one-way street after colonization. And space as well, we'll get to that in detail later in this book. It appeared first as a double colonization of time and space. I'm also arguing that the colonization of space and time are the two pillars of Western civilization. And so I discuss these two crucial concepts in chapter 4 and 5. Colonization of time was created by the Renaissance invention of the Middle Ages, the colonization of space by the colonization and conquest of the New World. However, modernity came along with coloniality. America was not an existing entity to be discovered. It was invented, mapped, appropriated, and exploited under the banner of Christian mission. It was not sitting there waiting to be discovered. During the span 1500 to 2000, three cumulative and not successive phases of modernity are discernible. The Iberian and Catholic phase, led by Spain and Portugal in 1500 to 1750 approximately. Then the quote-unquote heart of Europe, that is Hegel phase, led by England, France and Germany from 1750 to 1945. And the US-American phase, led by the United States in 1945 to 2000. Since then, a new global order has begun to unfold, a polycentric world interconnected by the same type of economy, that is capitalism as we know it, where humans are expendable and so is nature. That does not mean I'm a goddamn socialist, but some things are problematic in capitalism, which are the direct results of the Abrahamic episteme that created capitalism. And socialism is not a rectification, not a remedy for that, because socialism also is an Abrahamic idea and Abrahamic solution to an Abrahamic problem, and we can't have that. Another version of what happened between 1500 and 2000 is that the great transformation of the 16th century in the Atlantic that connected European initiatives, enslaved Africans, dismantled civilizations, Tawantinsuyu and Anahuac, Anyahuac, I don't know how to pronounce it, and the already in decay Maya, and encompassed the genocide in Haiti, which Columbus baptized Hispaniola in 1492. Then that was the emergence of a structure of control and management of authority, economy, subjectivity, gender, and sexual norms and relations that were driven by Western/Atlantic and European, basically Iberian Peninsula, Holland, France, and England. In what ways? Both in their internal conflicts and in their exploitation of labor and expropriation of land. Now, listen to this idea called internal conflicts. This is important. I need to highlight this. Why is internal conflicts necessary? Because this is exactly what happened in India. As we have discussed countless times, as Sai Deepak has discussed countless times, and as I discussed in the last video as well, that why doesn't liberal arts academia, sociology, anthropology, these things why aren't these ever able to solve the problems of India or casteism specifically? Because they were not designed or created to solve these problems. They were created first basically to observe, like, that's a nice animal in a cage and like a museum. Observe, collect data, and then create further divides. And if there are some fissures in that society, let's increase the fissure in that society. That is the problem with post-colonialism as well. And with decoloniality, we need to kick out that lens of looking at these societies and then solve those problems. So, as Walter de Mignolo writes here, that lens began to be applied even in their internal conflicts of the places where they went. Otoba Kugoano vividly depicted this scenario in the late 18th century. And the best thing about decolonial scholarship is, you'll notice that whenever they write something about their lands, Latin America, Caribbean, you will feel that they are writing exactly about Bharat, India, Hindus. And especially when they talk about capturing the minds of the native elites to propagate coloniality further. That's exactly what has happened in India through the class called Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Nehru, etc. Therefore, decoloniality is such a great framework that even though they have not done any India specific work, by just reading you'll realize that yeah, this exactly applies to India, just the way they have framed it. And that's why Sai Deepak's work is so important. Ottobah Cugoano vividly depicted this scenario in the late 18th century when he described the imperial organization of the slave trade inscribed in the emergence of the triangular Atlantic economy. He writes, the traffic of kidnapping and stealing men was begun by the Portuguese on the coasts of Africa, and as they found the benefit of it for their own wicked purposes, they soon went on to commit greater depredations. The Spaniards followed their infamous example, and the African slave trade was thought most advantageous of them, for them, to enable themselves to live in ease and affluence by the cruel subjection and slavery of others. The French and English and some other nations in Europe, and as they founded settlements and colonies in West Indies or in America, went on in the same manner and joined hand in hand with the Portuguese and Spaniards to rob and pillage Africa, as well as to waste and desolate the inhabitants of the western continent. But remember that slavery is okay for you to talk about only if we are talking about African slaves. The moment you talk about Hindus being taken as slaves by Islamic invaders and Middle Eastern colonialists, and their subsequent descendants who are the settler colonialists living here, somehow it's we are fascists or Hindu fascists, Hindu nationalists, etc. And as we have discussed earlier, Hindu nationalism is great because we are using nationalism to reclaim our past identities. The narrative stages a dramatic scenario behind which an enduring structure of management and control was being put in place as these kinds of events unfolded in the 16th and 17th centuries. Control and management means here that the actors and institutions engineering the game were establishing its rules on which the struggles for decision making would unfold. Africans and Indians did not participate in the process. This is Native Americans they're talking about when they say Indians. Global designs and their implementation were an affair of European Atlantic nations, those mentioned by Ottobah Cugoano. In the process, internal conflicts of interest emerged among Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England in connection with their vested interest in the African slave trade and Indians' land and labor. Thus, in the process, the rules of the imperial internal differences among European imperial states were established. For example, incentives launched by Elizabeth I against the brutality of the Spaniards in the New World that became known as the Black Legend. This is interesting. This I did not know. I just realized this right now. I had never heard of this. The internal differences between the colonizers that got established and extrapolated on the victims of coloniality, on the victims of colonization themselves. The rules of imperial internal differences among imperial states were established. Okay, the rules were established. We don't yet know whether or not it was applied on them as well. These were the conditions that prompted the emergence of a colonial matrix of power. The formations and transformations of patron colonial de poder. In its original formulation by Quijano, the patron colonial de poder, or colonial matrix of power, was described as 4 interrelated domains: control of the economy, of authority, of gender and sexuality, and of knowledge and subjectivity. The events unfolded in 2 parallel directions. One was the struggle among European imperial states, and the other was between these states and their enslaved and exploited African and Indian colonial subjects. Okay, I need to take a break here again. I need to see if any questions have come up, and I'll... Okay, Vanakkam from Tamil Nadu. Welcome. Yoga Janaki Raman. Kritika Rastagi, hi. This sounds like some mecha anime politics. I don't know if that's a funny thing or you're criticizing. Okay, and remember, if anyone feels like donating to my efforts here, the description box has my UPI ID, Nirajan Shah 83 at OK HDFC Bank. Okay, let's continue. What supports the four heads or interrelated spheres of management and control, the world order that is, and the two legs, that is, the racial and patriarchal foundations of knowledge, the enunciations in which the world order is legitimized? Let's give you another example here for this, which I discussed yesterday already. Ramon Grosfoguel, another of the foremost decolonial scholars, has said this in a live speech. It's available on YouTube. That um, go to any sociology classroom in the world, all you have are westernized universities, not Western universities, westernized universities all over the world: Singapore, Delhi, Japan, USA, anywhere. What's the problem with that? You go into the room and you see things and subjects and literature being uh, written by males of just 5 countries: Italy, Germany, France, USA, England. These are the 5 countries whose males form the entire syllabus of sociology, and and that represents just 12% of the world. That's what their entire knowledge system is based on. I explained below, and often to the idea in subsequent chapters. Remember that racial and patriarchal foundation of knowledge is starting here, not with Hinduism. That's why they see racism and patriarchy in everything, because they analyze the Indian society from those lenses, from the colonial lenses. I explained below and often return to the idea in subsequent chapters that the historical foundation of that colonial matrix, and hence of Western civilization, was theological. Not modernity, not rationality, not secularism, nothing, not science, purely Christian theology. It was Christian theology that located the distinction between Christians, Moors, and Jews in the blood. Let's underline this because this is great ammunition for debates. Historical foundation of the colonial matrix and of Western civilization was theological. Although the quarrel between the three religions of the book has a long history, it has been reconfigured since 1492, when Christians managed to expel Moors and Jews from the peninsula and enforced conversion on those who wanted to stay, and enforced conversion on those who wanted to stay. So, Ralif Galif Jalif. Simultaneously, the racial configuration between Spanish, Indian, and African began to take shape in the New World. By the 18th century, blood as a marker of race or racism was transferred to skin. This is interesting. Knowledge and subjectivity, racism and sexuality, authority, economy, 4 pillars on 2 legs: secular philosophy, theology, secular slash theological philosophy, and patriarchy. Schematic visualization of the colonial matrix of power. And theology was displaced by secular philosophy and sciences. The Linnaean system of classification helped the cause. Secular racism came to be based on the ego politics of knowledge. But it so happened that the agents and institutions that embodied secular ego politics of knowledge were like those who embodied theopolitics of knowledge, mostly white European males. So, the struggle between theologism, I need this neologism here. So, the struggle between theologism and secularism was a family feud. It was an internal discussion inside those civilizations inside those countries which colonized us. Proponents of both were Christian, white, and male, and assumed heterosexual relations as the norm. They did not think of any other kind of sexual relations other than heterosexuality. Consequently, they also classified gender distinctions and sexual normativity, which were then forced down upon the colonized societies, which we started following, forgetting our past, because we started thinking modernity is new, modernity is equal to great. In both cases, geo and body politics, understood as the biographic configuration of gender, religion, class, ethnicity, and language, the geo and body politics of knowledge configuration and epistemic desires were hidden, and the accent placed on the mind in relation to God and in relation to reason. Thus was the enunciation of Western epistemology configured, and thus was the structure of enunciation holding together the colonial matrix. Consequently, decolonial thinking and doing focus on the enunciation, engaging in epistemic disobedience, and delinking from the colonial matrix in order to open up decolonial options a vision of life and society that requires decolonial subjects, decolonial knowledges, and decolonial institutions, which we need in India direly. Decolonial thinking and options, that is, thinking decolonially, are nothing more than a relentless analytic effort to understand in order to overcome the logic of coloniality underneath the rhetoric of modernity. Ah, what a beautiful sentence. I have to underline this. Overcoming. What do we need to overcome here? Overcoming the logic of coloniality under the rhetoric of modernity. It's a rhetoric of modernity because everyone's all the time saying modernity is great, modernity is great. If it's modern, it's great. But what is that? Nothing but rhetoric. So underneath that rhetoric of modernity, what is there? The logic of coloniality. The structure of management and okay, what else? This is a long list. Relentless analytic effort to understand in order to overcome the logic of coloniality underneath the rhetoric of modernity, and the structure of management and control that emerged out of the transformation of the economy in the Atlantic, and the jump in knowledge that took place both in the internal history of Europe and in between Europe and its colonies, as we will see below. Needless to say, it is not this book nor any other or many of them on decoloniality that will make the difference. If we intellectuals or scholars and journalists do not follow the lead of the emerging global political society, referred to as social movements, which is why I think Hindutva is decoloniality. Take, for instance, the question of nature, which could be flagged as the fifth domain of the colonial matrix rather than consider it as part of the economic domain. During the past 10 years, the question of nature has been debated in the collective modernity/coloniality. Shall we consider nature as a fifth sphere, or as Annibal Quijano, the founder of decoloniality, should we consider nature in the economic sphere? It so happened that the contemplation of Pachamama, for Western minds nature, in the new constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador was incorporated not due to green movements, to the theology of liberation, or to Marxist anti-capitalism, but because of the simple fact and thinking of indigenous communities, leaders, and indigenous intellectuals. This is why Hinduism and Hindutva is so important, and Sanatan Dharma is so important. I'm too excited. I'll underline this and then explain it and discuss this further. See, being an environmentalist, being vegan, being woke are not associated, and they are all the people who use these terms and now want us to use green energy and get rid of all our coal so that we remain further poor. They are just giving Abrahamic solutions to Abrahamic problems. And remember, the first and foremost feature of colonialism and Abrahamism is that they create the problem and then sell you the solution. So see here, they destroyed nature. They got rid of all our science and called it philosophy. They got rid of all our history and called it mythology. They never let us, did not allow us to speak up and give our perspective on nature. They called us tree huggers. But now when environmentalists talk about nature, it always happens from the mouth of a Marxist. But what Mignolo is pointing out here, that the contemplation of nature in the new constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador was incorporated not due to the so-called green movements or theology of liberation or to Marxist anti-capitalism. But why? Because of the simple fact and thinking of indigenous communities themselves of Bolivia and Ecuador, which is the exact case with us. Always pre-Abrahamic pagan cultures have always had this syncretic relation with nature, and that is what we are also doing, and that is why the economic libertarians are a bit off on the nature issue and environment issue, what Sai Deepak terms as trying to create New Delhi in Himachal Pradesh. Now this is part of the struggle for the control of the colonial matrix of power based on the concept of nature, or on the contrary, delinking from it by arguing decolonially on the basis of the concept of Pachamama. I keep losing my mouse. There is no entity out there that is better understood as one or the other. There are different epistemic and political conceptualizations in the struggle for global futures. Yes, and that is why a different perspective need to come in. You can't say all religions are equally great, all religions are equally bad, all cultures are equally great, or all cultures are equally bad. Let's have this different perspectives. So what? There has to be just one ground rule. Don't try to come and kill me. If you come and try to kill me or change my way of life, I'll defend myself. That's just one basic rule. What's so complex about it? There is no entity out there that is better understood as one or the other. There are different epistemic and political conceptualizations in the struggle for global futures. Thus, the question is not so much where do we file nature as what are the issues that emerge from the analytic of the coloniality of nature, that is, its control and management, and in decolonial thinking and doing on environmental issues. There are joint efforts to contemplate, in the sense that scholarly decolonial thinkers contribute through our limited experiences and area of knowledge to decolonial thinkers in the field, that is, in the political society and in the state, as the cases of Bolivia, and in certain cases, and in certain sense of Ecuador illustrate. Just like it has happened in Ecuador and Bolivia. And let me check on the comment section again. সাউথ এশিয়া থেকে নাকি একটাই বই বেরিয়েছে ডিকলোনিয়ালিটি নিয়ে, ইন্ডিয়ার মতন আর কোন কোন দেশে এখনও বেরোতে পারেনি কলোনিয়ালিজম নিয়ে? ফিলিপিন্স, থাইল্যান্ড, ইন্দোনেশিয়া বেরিয়েছে? No, I don't think Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia have done any work on decoloniality because they are also busy with post-colonial South Asian studies. India theke, as far as I know, there's only one book from India that discusses this, that is India, that is Bharat, and Professor S.N. Balagangadhara from Ghent University in Belgium, his book, I forget the name of his book. Okay, I think 4 people are watching, that's fine.